I know this is old news already. Malcolm Gladwell released Talking to Strangers back in 2019. This is in the before times, but we're reading it as part of our office book club. We have a tendency towards backlist. It's important that the participants can get a hold of the book, especially at the library. So we're not picking Kristen Hanna's Four Winds, which is currently sitting at about 127 holds for 33 books. Besides, Malcolm Gladwell, local boy done good, born and raised just down the road from us in Elmira, multiple best-selling author, responsible for the massive Pushkin Industries podcast empire, well-loved at airport bookshops, and frankly, I hear the audiobook is fantastic, produced more like a podcast than an audiobook. It features musical beds, lovely transitions, interviews with the actual people in the book itself, so it gets recommended, and it seems like a harmless enough choice. Malcolm Gladwell, he of the pop science, and just a fantastic nonfiction writer. But as I start reading it, I find myself reading it more through my fingers. I reach out to one of my coworkers, and he sort of confirms. He gets maybe a third of the way through the book before he just nopes it completely. This book is a disaster. More than that, it's a fucking abomination. It's like Malcolm Gladwell is vying for talking head status over at Fox News. He's been red-pilled. I fully expect the lightly right intelligentsia book tour with one Jordan Peterson sometime in the near future. And yes, normally I do keep my vitriol for authors and their books off of this channel, but honestly, this is like a backlist book. He sold all the copies of this book that he's going to sell anyway, and frankly, he's a monster powerhouse in the book community. His revisionist history podcast regularly draws in about 3 million listeners per episode. And he always has a large marketing push behind a lot of his releases. He is going to be just fine. And besides, this past week, we've learned that all reviewers are just fucking nerds on a power trip, assholes that nobody likes. Poor reviews are akin to rape, or we're just like Nazis. And that's all just from one Lauren Huff. Seriously pissed off that someone took a 4.5-star review and rounded down to 4. I mean, seriously, take a breather. Fuck, this corner of the internet, bookish internet, really doesn't move the needle a lot in the face of a larger marketing effort. Take a look at American Dirt, just reviled here on the bookish internet for appropriation and just her simplistic language. And gosh, it made a ton of bestseller lists, even made best of the year lists. And it's like none of the outcry on the internet had any impact at all. And I think the same is going to happen with Lauren Huff. There is so much marketing effort behind her latest book. I'm sure it'll be just fine and she can just laugh this whole thing off. Malcolm Gladwell really does not have to fucking worry about me talking about his book in this tiny little booktube corner. Talking to Strangers opens with a case of an African-American woman by the name of Sandra Bland, who's pulled over in Prairie View, Texas, by an officer, a white officer by the name of Brian Encina. Things quickly escalate, and Bland finds herself in jail for failing to signal a lane change. She's still in jail 3 days later when she is discovered dead by suicide in her cell. And this is how you start a book that is ostensibly about miscommunication, about strangers' inability to talk to each other. Already my hackles are up. I'm not exactly sure how to take this, and I'm not sure I'm following along. In the ensuing year since the publication of that book, we've had Black Lives Matter, protests to defund the police. We've had, most recently, the incidents with Dante Wright, but of course George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. We have incidences of Buffalo police officers shoving a 75-year-old man to the concrete where he suffered brain injuries. We're just seeing lots of police bad behavior, and we're going to wave that away for miscommunication. It just seems like a bit of a stretch. And Sandra Bland's story bookends Talking with Strangers. 300 pages later, after talking about notions of transparency and our need to default to the truth, I feel no more convinced that Sandra Bland and Brian Encina simply couldn't talk to each other, and that it was two strangers approaching each other that led to the tragic events. We learned that Sandra Bland was justifiably upset. In her adult life, she'd had over 10 different run-ins with the police that had left her saddled with over $8,000 in fine, leaving her seriously in debt. So yes, she was a little freaked out when she saw a police officer accelerating behind her car. Encina explains that she's doing that to simply see if there's anything suspicious about the vehicle. Meanwhile, Bland is a little freaked out and wants to get out of the police officer's way, changes lanes to do so, does so without signaling, and bam, reason to be pulled over. Encina is simply following the Kansas City policing manual that looks to pull over vehicles for minor infractions to see if there's some more serious crimes going on. So, while Encina is running the plates, Bland is justifiably upset and anxious, and somehow we are led to believe that Bland now suddenly feels threatened, that he is terrified for his life, and we're just going to take that at face value, this coming out in court after Bland had died by suicide. Of course, Encina is going to say something like that, and we're going to willfully ignore and not even mention in the book that Encina was indicted for perjury for making those statements. The case was dropped in exchange for the fact that Encina can no longer practice law enforcement for the rest of his life. We're just going to ignore this power dynamic at play here, that Officer Encina just completely escalated a situation that didn't need to be escalated, that frankly a barista at Starbucks would be better equipped to diffuse. And if Gladwell is honest about anything in this entire fiasco, it is that Encina is simply doing what he was trained to do. The same thing happened with Dante Wright, who was pulled over for having an air freshener visible hanging from his rearview mirror. Gladwell talks about how officers refer to this as a felony forest, often used to hide the smell of weed. It is innocuously referred to as a curiosity tickler. It is an indication that maybe there is some more serious crimes that can be investigated, a reason to go beyond the ticket. And something as innocuous as a curiosity tickler has real-world consequences. In 2015, the Washington Post ran a study and found that over 100 people across the United States had died as a result of a traffic stop by police. 1 in 3 of those people were black. And to attribute that to miscommunication, crossed wires, and the incomplete transfer of information seems like a huge fucking stretch, while willfully ignoring the notions of driving while black and policing for profit. And maybe I'm the moron here. Maybe this is just a knee-jerk social justice warrior reaction to that, and I'm lacking all the nuance that Gladwell and his big brain brings to this conversation. But then Gladwell has to go and defend the case of Brock Turner. And I think, how has Gladwell not been fucking canceled? I mean, has Gladwell been canceled? Have I missed the canceling? Brock Turner, the Stanford University swim star, the son of a civilian contractor to the United States Air Force, charged for 20 minutes of action, serving 3 months of his 6-month sentence, handed down by one Judge Aaron Persky, also a Stanford alum, who felt that prison would severely impact this fine young man. And frankly, Brock Turner has a lot of people in his corner and doesn't need the additional help of Malcolm Gladwell. And yet Gladwell uses this as a springboard to put forward his notion that alcohol causes mental myopia. This, the Brock Turner case, not incidents of drunken brawls or bouts of vandalism or injuries sustained as a result of jackass-style heroics. No, instead we are going to argue that sexual assault is a failure to agree on the rules of consent because alcohol causes mental myopia, that Brock Turner was ill-equipped to understand fully what it was he was doing when he was raping an unconscious girl, leaving aside the fact that he still had enough of a self-preservation instinct to try and run and hide when he was discovered, to minimize sexual assault as an individual exerting power and control over another individual sexually, and instead calling that miscommunication and putting the blame on some of the victim as well for not clearly communicating their intentions. That just seems like a hard fucking no. Last month, the Minnesota Supreme Court ruled that it is not rape to have sex with an unconscious woman as long as she got drunk voluntarily. And while it might be unfair to say that this is a result of his book and his idea that alcohol causes mental myopia, I don't think Gladwell would hesitate to jump to make that connection. He would frame it in some fancy-sounding name like mass market momentum and argue that a bestseller can move the judicial Overton window and that we need to stop policing male desire, and he would explain it all in his smoothest of podcasty voices. I don't know, it just feels like a massive amount of hubris to take these flashpoint issues and to mansplain them away and start off with a, well, actually, Brock Turner was not suffering mental myopia. This wasn't a miscommunication of his intent. Brock Turner is a rapist. To argue otherwise seems willfully dumb, and then suddenly everything else in the book seems willfully dumb, narrowly focused, and cherry-picking facts to further a pre-existing argument. The fact that Hitler warmly shook Chamberlain's hand with 2 hands, so that meant he wasn't going to invade Poland, seems more than a little like an oversimplification and kind of ridiculous. These Gladwellian insights seem more tuned to the current climate of pseudoscience, Facebook facts, and social media hot takes. You can tell Gladwell just desperately wants to enter another word into the lexicon like tipping point and 10,000 hour rule, but this book is a huge swing and a miss. It reads like an opinion piece, a 300-page letter to the editor instead of a well-researched, finely tuned piece of nonfiction. I mean, it has all the rigor, research-wise, of an online anti-vaxxer. It's just a frickin' mess, and it's just hard to read. And I'm kind of angry that the Work Book Club made me read this. I'm curious to see what the group has to say at our end of the month discussion. Try and keep a tamp on all of this and just sort of listen with open ears. Honestly, it was reading through my fingers because at a certain point, it's just like, this thing is just a hot mess, and I just don't want to spend any more time on this thing if I don't have to. God, so painful. Anyway, that was it. It was hard enough doing that. I'm hoping this doesn't throw me into a massive reading slump. Things are a mess here in Canada. Vaccine distribution is just, an abomination. It's just a dumpster fire. I don't know how long we're going to have to wait. And we're on another lockdown. We have all the variants coming in. And it's just feeling like the worst, hardest, most precarious time. Hopefully things are better wherever the heck you are. It seems like with my daughter's Discord out in the United States, you're doing a fantastic job. If you actually want to have the vaccine, you are getting it. All her friends in their 20s have already been vaccinated. And here, we're just waiting for our first one. It could be months away. It's hard not to feel a little tired and exhausted and just beat up by the whole situation itself. And then to read something like this. Anyway, that's enough from me. That is it for me this week. I hope you guys are having a good week of reading, and we'll talk to you again soon.